Hello, everybody. It's Tyler with 3D Printing Basics. If you guys were interested in getting every single episode of this podcast, 3D Printing Basics, ad-free and a week early, and also getting exclusive perks such as exclusive episodes that only you can listen to and more, then subscribe on Patreon. My link will be down below. I would really appreciate it if you guys would consider supporting me. All the support I've already received has meant the world to me, so thank you guys so much. If not, no worries. Continue to consume these episodes for free, and I appreciate you listening regardless. So thank you guys very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hello, and welcome back to 3D Printing Basics. This is episode number 107, and in this week's episode, we are going to be discussing 3D printer enclosures. We're going to be talking about what they are, we're going to be talking about what they do, and when not to use them. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you guys for all the support. I really appreciate it. I'm seeing it everywhere on every single channel that I post on. It just really means the world to me that you guys are still willing to listen in and offer meaningful insight and suggestions 107 episodes in. So thank you guys so much for the support. And with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So 3D printer enclosures, I feel like nowadays they probably aren't as relevant as they once were, given that so many printers now come with a built-in enclosure, but they definitely are still very important and still play a big role in the 3D printing space today. So let's talk about what an enclosure is. A 3D printer enclosure can be defined as basically anything or any part that you use to enclose your 3D printer, to cover it up, to kind of protect it, and overall just make sure that no drafts, it has a controllable temperature, no air conditioning or any kind of wind gusts touch it, and yeah, just an overall protective environment that is meant to regulate the temperature and the kind of the environment of the 3D printer itself while it is 3D printing. So 3D printing enclosures, they can literally be anything from a cardboard box that you place over your 3D printer to a super complex third-party built-in enclosure. Now, when I was actually first getting started in 3D printing, when I had my Etsy shop and I was just selling things on there, my most popular item was actually a 3D printer enclosure. It was a third party. It was designed by a member of the community, and I licensed basically the design out so that I could sell the parts to it. It was for the Bambu Lab P1P because back in that time, the P1S had not been released yet, so it wasn't a thing, and they just had the P1P, and people wanted to kind of have the part enclosed, and Bambu Labs built the P1P to be very modular. So a user or a Bambu Labs printer user designed a 3D printer enclosure, and I sold the parts for it. And people could take those parts and they could attach it to their 3D printer, their P1P, and then they had an enclosed P1P. It was basically a P1S before the P1S. And the test trial that I did with this, I actually still have that printer, that P1P that is now fully enclosed. So I still have it. It still works great. And yeah, so that's just an example of the enclosures that I was dealing with back in the day. And like I said, nowadays, most enclosures are going to be a part of the printer already, like the P1Ss, the X1 Carbons, the H2Ss, the H2Ds. They're all just going to come with enclosures. Even the Sovals that I had, the Soval SV08 and the SV08 Max, they have the option to purchase enclosures, which I did for both of them, and they were built in. Yeah, enclosures are just, they're pretty popular now, and they come with almost every single 3D printer. But, now that we know what they are, let's again dive a little bit deeper into the main purposes that they serve. So the most important factor of a 3D printer enclosure is going to be temperature control. It is meant to control the environment that 3D printers are printing in. Whether you want it to be a little hotter, whether you want it to be a little colder, although most of the time you're using an enclosure because you want the surrounding print space and the air around the 3D printer to be hotter. This is because usually enclosures are used for printing the higher temperature materials, so the PETG, the TPU, the ABSs, and the ASAs. They are also a necessity to be used, I would add, if you're using ABS or ASA, and the higher engineering filaments like the PCs, the Peaks, the Ultim, 1010s, all of those materials, it's a must that you use that. But so its biggest factor is to control the temperature around your 3D printer and contain and create a consistent environment. Another thing is for draft protection, especially if you are just a hobbyist like most of you listening are, and you have a 3D printer in your house. You want the 3D printer enclosure to protect it from the AC kind of drafting down on it. That was actually a big problem I had when I was running 3D printers out of my bedroom. I got a second one. I had it placed in what I thought was a good spot. Couldn't get a good print to save my life. It just was not adhering to the build plate. And I figured out that the AC was actually pointing directly at the 3D printer itself. So while it was printing, that draft from the AC was going onto the 3D printer and it was messing up the cooling, which was why it couldn't get a successful print. So that is definitely something to consider. Getting an enclosure for is if you can't move it or you have some kind of gusts or drafts affecting your 3D prints overall. Another thing it's for is for safety and containment. A lot of people will attach fans to their 3D printer enclosures, and they have activated carbon filters, and that filters out the fumes. And while 3D printing, it definitely does have harmful fumes. There are some 3D printer filaments that give off very toxic fumes that you don't want to be around at all. Just in general, it's probably best to have some sort of air filtration system so that you aren't constantly breathing in that melted plastic fumes, because while they can say that they're non-toxic, melted plastic is melted plastic, and it's probably not the best for you to be breathing in. So that's definitely something to consider. Another thing is that they are really good at noise reduction. So noise reducing these enclosures, if you enclose something, it's going to be definitely a little bit quieter than if you kind of left it open. It's going to contain some of those sounds, some of that whipping around that the 3D printer is doing. It's just overall, it can just help a little bit with that, sort of dampen and muffle that sound. So those are kind of the main factors that a 3D print enclosure is for. And it's definitely going to be, if one of those things kind of suits your needs, and I would definitely recommend getting it versus not getting it. And so when you're going to need an enclosure, when you absolutely have to have it, is like I mentioned earlier, for when you're printing those higher temperature materials like the ABS, the ASA. That's kind of as deep as most beginners get when it comes to high temperature filaments. Maybe a little bit of PC, maybe a little bit of PEEK, but as far as my experience goes and the people that I've talked to, ABS and ASA is definitely among the higher end of high temperature filaments that beginners are going to print with. And you cannot print ABS or ASA without an enclosed printer. You just can't do it. You can try and print it on your bed slinger, your Crealities, your Prusas, your non-enclosed printers, your Bamboo Labs A1s, A1 Minis. Try it. Just try it. I guarantee it will not work. It's just the temperature is just, it's too high. It needs the surrounding air to be, at least 50 or 60 degrees Celsius, and it just can't do that without an enclosure. So if you're planning on printing ABS or ASA and you don't have an enclosed printer, I would recommend getting one. And, like I said, back in the day, it was more third-party enclosures. Nowadays, most printers come with enclosure options. You can also get third-party enclosures. Clearview Plastics is definitely one of the companies that they specialize in making enclosures for 3D printers. So definitely take a look at that. It could be an option. When I was working at my old job, we actually fabricated one out of steel and plastic for our Prusa MK3S. We built one, so that was nice to kind of keep all the heat in and help everything out there. But yeah, so just overall, 3D printing enclosures, when you're going to need one, is when you're printing that higher temperature filament. You just simply can't get away with it. You absolutely need it. So moving on, now that we've talked about when you might need an enclosure, let's talk about when you don't need one. And the biggest thing here is going to be if you're printing PLA. If you have an enclosed printer and you keep it enclosed when printing PLA, that can actually negatively affect your parts. Most of my printers are enclosed. Most of them are Bamboo Labs printers that are fully enclosed. And whenever I'm printing PLA, which is more often than I am printing other materials in those machines, I leave the door open or I leave the top off for the ones that don't have an AMS. At the end of the day, PLA is a really low temperature material, so it'll melt or deform at a reasonably low temperature. And if you leave the thing fully enclosed and let the surrounding air heat up to a pretty decent temperature, pretty much the maximum that it can reach with the heat bed and just the heat from the printer moving itself can manually heat up the thing without an actual plug-in, like electric heater, you are going to have some issues. Just PLA, the cooling is so finicky, and it's a very delicate material to print with. If the cooling is messed up because the air around it is too hot and it can't cool properly, then you're just going to have failed print after failed print. So if you're running a 3D printer and it's enclosed and you're running PLA and it keeps failing and you can't figure out why, leave the door open or take the enclosure all the way off if you can. If you're primarily going to be printing PLA, you don't need an enclosure. You just don't. It's plenty fine to be able to, run by itself. If you have a problem with drafts or like your AC is pointing right at it, a sheet of cardboard to block that wind is all you need. You don't need a full enclosure. And I've failed a lot more prints than I care to admit because the printer was fully enclosed and I didn't understand what was going on. It was actually pretty recent that I really realized that, hey, it's a priority, especially for me in my case, when you have 14 printers in one room and they're all running simultaneously, that is a lot of heat that builds up. And so on top of the heat bed and the hot end making the surrounding air hot itself, the air is already naturally, it's kind of preheated, it's kind of like a little bit warm just because there's so much heat coming off of all the printers collecting in the one little room. The room is not very big, and so it collects and it sits and it acts like its own personal heater kind of. So you can definitely have some problems printing PLA. Also PETG too, it's kind of hit or miss. I usually keep my doors closed and the printer fully enclosed when printing PETG. I've had successes, I've had failures with keeping the doors closed and open. That is kind of something that is definitely going to be dependent on your climate and your environment to try and figure that out. I would definitely recommend running some tests with the printer enclosed and not enclosed to see what results you get, to see if you can, kind of figure out what works best for you. But for me, I usually keep PETG prints enclosed. It has never hurt me, but I can't really tell if it helped either. So I think just more so the ease of use of just keeping the door closed so that it's not dangling around out there. That's probably why I do it. But yeah, I can't say either way which one is better. That's definitely something that you are going to have to test and kind of find out. So now that we're kind of through the general sort of education of 3D print enclosures and what they do, we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons. And so some of the pros for the 3D printer enclosure is going to be, like I mentioned, when you're printing the high temperature materials, it's an absolute must. You're going to get successful prints if you use the enclosure, and you're going to have a really hard time getting them if you don't. You're going to have more consistent results, even if you're not using the ABS or the ASA. If you're using TPU or PETG, you generally are going to get a more consistent finish on your 3D prints just because the environment is more consistent. It's not going to be hotter when the AC is off, colder when the AC is on. It's going to maintain that steady temperature, and it's going to be easier for you to tweak the print settings if you want to make some subtle changes to get your prints turning out a little bit better. Another thing is that, of course, added safety. Like I mentioned, if you wanted to add a fan with a carbon filter, you're going to be able to kind of contain those fumes and just overall get a little bit more safer, because breathing in melted plastic is definitely not something that you should be doing regularly. And for those of you who are concerned about me and my 14 printers that I have up in that room, I have a very powerful air filter that is actually running all the time. So yeah, I make sure that I'm taking all the safety precautions that I can and making sure that I stay safe up there. So please don't worry about me. I definitely have it all handled there. Some of the cons, definitely extra cost, whether you're building it yourself or it's an add-on from the printer or from the printer company itself. Even from Bamboo Labs, from the P1P to the P1S, you're going to be paying a little bit more. Usually it's at in between $100 and $200 extra dollars. So that is definitely something to factor into the cost. If you're not going to be printing these high temperature filaments a whole lot, it may not make sense to spend that extra money on an enclosure. Another thing is that it takes up overall space, especially if you're getting one of these third-party ones where it's more like a box, or you're just using a cardboard box. That's going to take up a larger footprint because it obviously has to be bigger. And if you're using a cardboard box, then obviously you can't see or monitor the print unless you have some kind of camera inside. So that is definitely something to consider. Another thing is that it can overheat the electronics and cause electronic failure. I have never had this happen to me. Most 3D printers have the electronics that are built to last in a high temperature environment. So I wouldn't say that's a huge worry that you're going to have, but definitely another con for sure is going to be the PLA printing process. I know most of us out there are printing PLA a majority of the time, and if you get an enclosure, then that could cause a lot more problems than it's worth. So that is definitely something to consider there. But with that being said, that's kind of all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and definitely learned something about 3D printer enclosures, kind of when to use them, when to not use them, and when to consider getting one for your 3D printer. I wanted to thank you guys all again for the support. It really means the world to me that you guys check in every single week to listen. I will talk to you guys next time. Thank you guys so much for listening.